Keep up, Chuck. David Carradine threw a left jab at full speed at Chuck Norris's face. Chuck slipped it by 4 inches. Carradine's right cross was already coming, and Chuck caught it on his left forearm in a textbook outside block. He didn't strike back. On a dry riverbed outside Texas, in 1983, the filming of Lone Wolf McQuade was well underway. The gravel sat at 104 degrees, and the Panavision camera was locked on a low dolly 40 feet from where the 2 leads stood. The whole crew had stopped to watch this one. Word had been moving through base camp for 2 hours that today was the day it was finally going to happen. The tension between the 2 stars had been building for over a week, and everyone on set could feel it. Carradine threw a left hook at Chuck. It was the 3rd punch in the combination, and it was fully committed. Chuck rolled his head under it, and the hook passed clean over the top of his hair. Carradine reset, breathing hard already. He threw the lead leg roundhouse next, the kick he'd thrown on television over 100 times, but never for real, against a man who wasn't standing on a mark. Chuck checked it, raising his own thigh into the path of the kick, and Carradine's leg landed back on the gravel. He threw it again. Same result. What followed in the next 30 seconds was the only real fight David Carradine and Chuck Norris ever had. It nearly jeopardized the entire film, and it wouldn't be told publicly for 37 years. 9 days earlier, Chuck's main stunt coordinator Bob Wall walked David Carradine through the first 11 beats of the fight choreography at quarter speed. Together with Chuck, they had built a full fight scene with 41 beats over 9 weeks of rehearsal on a Burbank stage, and Chuck had drilled every one of them. Carradine had skipped the Burbank rehearsals, so the riverbed was the first time he had ever run the choreography. He listened, he nodded, and he did the beats. The work was acceptable. On day 2 of filming, beats 12 through 22 of the fight choreography, Carradine was bored. He had played a martial artist on television for 3 seasons, and he believed, the way some actors do, that fight choreography was something he could pick up by intuition. He complained to the second director at lunch, "This is a karate film, not a Bergman picture. We don't need to drill it like one." She wrote it down in her notebook, because she wrote everything down. On day 3, beats 23 through 31, Carradine started pushing. Not full speed, just a little harder than the choreography called for. Bob Wall caught it on the 3rd beat. "The pace is the pace," Bob told him. "Bob, I'm an actor," Carradine said. "The pace has to live." Bob just repeated it. "David, the pace is the pace." That night, at dinner at the Stagecoach Inn coffee shop, Bob sat down across from Chuck. "You feel him pushing," he said. "I feel him," Chuck said. "You want me to talk to him?" "Not yet," Chuck said. "He's going to push it until he's certain." "Let him be certain, then we'll see." On day 6, Thursday the 10th of February, between setups at 10:15 in the morning, Carradine was sitting in his canvas chair by the wardrobe truck eating an apple, with 5 crew members in earshot. He spoke loud enough for all of them to hear. Kung Fu, the show, was the real article. What Chuck did was point karate, and point karate was to fighting what a dance recital was to a knife fight. Lisa Howell, the makeup girl, told Bob Wall over lunch. Bob walked to Chuck's trailer at 12:43. "He said it again," he said. "Who heard it?" Chuck asked. "Mara, Lisa, Doug Saxby, 2 electricians. The apple was in his hand at the time." "Then the whole unit's got it by dinner," Chuck said. "What do you want me to do?" Bob asked. "Nothing," Chuck said. "He'll say it again. He has to. I'll handle it then." On Friday the 11th of February, during the 3rd take of the wide shot on beat 14, Carradine was supposed to throw an open-hand parry at the back of Chuck's right wrist at half speed. Just a marker, a tap, nothing more. Instead, he drove it at full speed and made flush contact with the radial nerve. Chuck's hand went half to sleep, but he didn't call cut. He finished the take. When the assistant director called cut, Chuck walked across the gravel and stopped 6 feet from Carradine. "David, we're not doing it that way." Carradine grinned. "It's a fight scene, Chuck. Fight scenes have contact. If you swing for me one more time at full speed," Chuck said, "you'll get one back at full speed, and we won't be filming after that." Steve Carver, watching from the monitor, heard it and called a 30-minute break. On Saturday, the 12th of February, during the second take of Beat 17, the grazing shoulder strike, Carradine threw the parry at full speed again. Chuck slipped it, but the strike grazed the meat of his shoulder. This time Carver walked across the riverbed himself. "David, we are not insurance liable for a knockout. This stops." "Steve, tell your lead to keep up," Carradine said. Chuck didn't move. He just looked at Carver and said quietly, "Steve, let's run it one more time, same beat." Carver saw something in Chuck's face he hadn't seen on the picture before. He rolled the camera, and the take was clean. Carradine didn't push. That night Bob came to Chuck's room at 7:30. "He's not done," he said. "I know," said Chuck. "He's going to do it again Monday, on the Master." "I know. What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. Same as before." "Chuck, he's going to do it in front of 41 people. Then 41 people will see what happens." Bob looked at him for a long time, said, "All right," and went back to his room. Sunday was a day off. Chuck ran 4 miles on the shoulder of Highway 20 before breakfast. Carradine didn't come out of his room until 2 in the afternoon. By 10 o'clock Monday morning, word had moved through the unit. Lisa had told Wardrobe, Wardrobe had told the second camera assistant, and the second camera assistant had told the boom operator. By lunch, all 41 people on the unit knew that on the master shot of Beat 22, the close-quarters elbow exchange, David Carradine was going to push, and Chuck Norris was going to answer. Nobody left the riverbed at lunch. They ate sandwiches out of boxes, sitting on apple boxes, and stayed close. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Steve Carver called the master. Mark Egerton walked the slate to the front of the camera, and the first AC called speed. Carver looked at Chuck, then at Carradine, and held the call 3 seconds longer than usual. Action. Carradine stepped in on the diagonal. His right hand came up in the choreographed parry, and Chuck's left hand came up in the choreographed answer. The two hands were supposed to meet in the air at half speed. They didn't. Carradine drove the parry at full speed, and it was no longer a parry. It was an elbow, committed and aimed at Chuck's temple. Chuck pivoted 6 inches off the line. It was the switch stance pivot he'd learned from Master Shin in a converted house in Songtan in February of 1960, the same pivot he'd thrown against Joe Louis at the Sportatorium in December of 1967, and against Steve McQueen on a dojo mat in Sherman Oaks in August of 1969. The pivot was half an inch and a whole lifetime. The elbow passed through the air where his temple had been a quarter second earlier. Carradine's body was over-rotated, his weight forward, his lead foot planted. Chuck didn't strike. He reset and said, "David." Carradine had expected the pivot. He'd been planning the next punch since the night before, and threw the cross with his right hand, full extension, full commitment, at Chuck's jaw. Chuck slipped half a step to his own left, and the cross passed 4 inches off his cheekbone. "David, don't," he said again. Carradine threw the hook. It was the third punch of the combination, the one he'd thrown in fights on Kung Fu for 130 episodes. A left hook, tight, brought up from the hip, technically clean. Chuck rolled his head under it, and the hook passed over the top of his hair. The riverbed was silent. Carver hadn't called cut. Egerton's hand was still half raised. Carradine reset, already breathing hard. The whiskey from the night before was still in his system. He hadn't slept, and 3 full-speed punches in that heat at that altitude took more out of a 46-year-old man than he wanted to admit. His gi top was gray with riverbed dust where his elbow had brushed the gravel on the pivot, and his knuckles were split from the impact of the hook finding only empty air. He wasn't stopping. He threw the lead leg roundhouse, the kick Cam Yuen had taught him in 1972 for the Kung Fu pilot. He'd thrown it on television 140 times, but never for real, against a man who wasn't standing on a mark. Chuck checked it, raising his own lead thigh 4 inches and turning it 20 degrees, the same motion he'd practiced on the heavy bag in his garage in Tarzana for 25 years. The check didn't damage Carradine. It didn't need to. It simply told him the technique was wrong for this opponent. Carradine's leg landed back on the gravel, and his expression had changed. The grin from day 7 was gone. He threw the same roundhouse again, same line, same result. Chuck checked it on the angle of his thigh, and a small bruise began forming on the outside of Carradine's shin, where he'd caught that angle twice now. Bob Wall stood 12 feet inside the riverbed, hands at his sides, reading the fight the way he'd read fights for 30 years. What he saw was Chuck in complete control and Carradine in complete commitment, and the only open question was how long that commitment would last before the body throwing it understood what the man receiving it was doing. Carradine threw the spinning back kick, the signature move of Kung Fu's second season, taught to him by Cam Yuen in that same 1972 session. He'd thrown it on television 126 times, never for real against a moving man. Chuck read the rotation as it started, and stepped 2 feet inside the line of the kick. Carradine's spinning foot passed a foot behind Chuck's left shoulder, leaving him standing on one leg with his back fully turned. There were at least 4 ways to end the fight in that moment. An elbow to the kidney, a hand to the back of the neck, a sweep of the planted leg, a shove to walk him onto his knees. Chuck did none of them. He placed his open right hand flat on the back of Carradine's left shoulder, used the joint as a pivot, turned him around to face him, and stepped back. "David, that's enough." Facing him again, Carradine said, "The hell it is." He committed the combination he'd been holding back. Jab, cross, lead hand uppercut. The uppercut wasn't in the choreography. It was a punch he'd taught himself in his backyard in Topanga Canyon in 1974, convinced Kung Fu needed a new finisher, and he'd never thrown it on camera before now. Chuck parried the jab with his left hand and slipped the cross by moving his head 3 inches off the line. But the uppercut came up from below and found him. It clipped the bottom of his jaw. The contact wasn't flush, and it wasn't a knockout. It was the punch of a 46-year-old man on day 9 of a fight sequence, 3 whiskeys still in his system from the night before, landing at maybe 40% of full force. But it landed. For the first time in the fight, Chuck took a step backward. The riverbed made a small sound, not a gasp, not a cheer. Just 41 people realizing at once that the lead of their picture had just been hit. Carradine saw the step, saw the contact on the chin, and thought, for 1 second, in the part of his mind where the whiskey was still talking, "I did it." He threw the follow-up, the same hook from the 3rd beat, convinced Chuck was rocked, convinced the uppercut had done its work, convinced one more clean strike would put Chuck Norris on the gravel in front of 41 witnesses and end the argument forever about Kung Fu and point karate and what real fighting was. He was wrong about all of it. Chuck hadn't been rocked. He'd stepped back because the strike had come in on a vector he hadn't given Carradine credit for, and stepping back was simply what a man trained by Master Shin did to reset distance when a variable changed. The step back was data, not damage. The hook came in, and this time Chuck didn't slip it. He caught it on his left forearm, the same outside block he'd drilled 20,000 times on the heavy bag. But as the hook landed, his right hand was already moving, not to strike, but to control Carradine's wrist. He had the wrist in his right hand and the elbow against his own left forearm. He had both of Carradine's arms, his weight committed forward from the hook, and his lead foot planted on a loose patch of gravel beside the dolly track. He turned the wrist outward, kotegaeshi, though Chuck hadn't learned it from a Japanese master, but from a Korean grandmaster in a converted house outside an Air Force base in 1960. Carradine's body had to follow the wrist, turning his torso 45 degrees and pulling his lead foot off its plant. Chuck's right leg hooked behind Carradine's planted left calf. It was the same sweep from the Joe Louis fight, a technique Chuck had thrown multiple times in his life. The sweep didn't require force. It required geometry, and Carradine's own forward momentum and controlled wrist did the rest. Carradine went down. Not theatrically, not catastrophically. He went down because the geometry of the situation left him no way to stay upright. He landed on his back, on the riverbed gravel. The sound of his shoulder blades hitting the stones was, as boom operator Daniel Pruitt would later describe it to his roommate in Westwood, the sound of a man's life rearranging itself. Chuck stepped one full pace back, hands at his sides. His expression was the same one Skipper Mullins had described after the Joe Louis fight at the Sportatorium in 1967. Not proud, not relieved, but sad, like a man who'd just had to do something he didn't want to do. The riverbed stayed silent. Carver hadn't called cut. Egerton hadn't lowered his hand. The boom mic still hung in the air over an empty patch of ground 10 feet from where the fight had actually happened. Carradine lay on his back for 3 full seconds, his chest rising and falling, his eyes on the cloudless February sky. A cut on his lip, where his teeth had clipped the inside of his mouth on the fall, had begun to bleed onto his chin. He wasn't seriously hurt. The fall had only taken his wind, and the gravel would leave bruising under his shoulder blades, but there was no joint torque and no strike to the head. Chuck was too disciplined a fighter to break a man on a film set, even one who'd spent the last 15 seconds trying to break him. Then Carradine sat up, pushed himself onto his elbows, and looked at Chuck. 6 feet from the dolly track, Mara Whitehead had her continuity log open and her pen in hand, and though it was shaking, she wrote down what he said next, because she wrote everything down. "All right, Chuck," he said. Chuck didn't answer. Carradine said it again. "All right." Chuck extended his right hand. "All right." Chuck extended his right hand. Carradine looked at it for 2 seconds before taking it, and Chuck pulled him to his feet. His gi top was gray down the back from the gravel, the cut on his lip still bleeding onto his chin, his knuckles split, and a bruise the size of an apple forming on his shin. He didn't let go of Chuck's hand right away. He held it a second longer than the pull-up required. "Chuck," he said, low, "I'm sorry." "It's all right, David," Chuck said. Carradine let go. Carver finally said, "Cut." Egerton's hand came down. The boom operator lowered the mic, and the first AD said into his walkie, "Reset to 1. Hold the unit." Nobody on the riverbed moved for 10 seconds. Then Bob Wall was at Chuck's elbow, having crossed the gravel in 5 paces. "You all right?" he said, low. "I'm all right, Bob." "The uppercut. I saw it. I gave it to him." "Why?" "Because he needed to land one. He'd have come back tomorrow if he hadn't." "You took a punch on purpose." "I took a punch so the picture finishes." Bob looked at him for a long time, said, "All right," and walked back to the monitor. Chuck walked to his Bronco, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat with his feet on the gravel for 2 full minutes without starting the engine. Steve Carver came over and stopped 6 feet away. "Chuck, Steve, I'm calling the wrap on the day." "I know. I'll see you tomorrow at 6:30. We'll talk about the rest of the sequence in my trailer at 6. "All right, Steve." Carver walked away. Chuck closed the door, turned the key, and drove off the Riverbed Access Road onto Highway 20, back to the Stagecoach Inn. Carradine drove himself back to the motel at 4:20 that afternoon. He skipped the coffee shop and went straight to his room, where he called his agent, Robert Cohen, at the William Morris Agency in Beverly Hills. The call lasted 48 minutes. Cohen called Steve Carver at 6:30 that evening with 3 demands. The footage from the Day 9 master shot could not appear in the final cut. The scripted finale had to be rewritten so the Wilkes character didn't lose the hand-to-hand fight, honoring the contract clause from November, and the Day 10 call sheet had to be adjusted so Chuck and Carradine wouldn't share a setup for 48 hours. Carver agreed to all 3. He had no choice. There were 13 pages left to shoot. The opening weekend was set for the 5th of August, and the studio was watching the budget. On Day 10, Tuesday the 17th of February, Carradine arrived on set at 6:30. The cut on his lip was covered with makeup, the bruise on his shin hidden by his trousers. He sat in his canvas chair and drank black coffee. Chuck arrived in the Bronco at 6:25 and went straight to Carver's trailer. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Carver laid out William Morris's 3 demands. Chuck listened, then said, "Steve, give him the 3. I'll do the rest of the work." "Chuck," Carver started. "I gave him the uppercut yesterday for a reason," Chuck said. "He's not going to push again. Let him have the contract. The picture finishes." "All right," Carver said. Chuck stood and walked out. He saw Carradine on the way to wardrobe, nodded once, and Carradine nodded back. Neither spoke. The fight sequence was rewritten, and the last 4 beats were reworked. For the first time in the production, Carver shot the closing scenes using stunt doubles. The on-screen fight ended in a draw, and the Wilkes character was killed instead by a grenade Chuck's character threw in the final beat, an ending that has puzzled viewers for 43 years, and one produced entirely by the William Morris clause. Chuck and Carradine shared 2 more setups over the following 4 days. Neither pushed, and there were no further incidents. Both men worked professionally and returned to their trailers between takes. The picture wrapped at 4:30 on Tuesday, the 23rd of February. At the wrap party, at the Stagecoach Inn, the unit photographer took one photograph of the 2 leads together, standing in front of the swimming pool. Chuck wore jeans and a denim jacket. Carradine wore a black silk shirt. They were shaking hands, Steve Carver half visible behind them. Neither man was smiling. The photograph ran in The Hollywood Reporter on the 2nd of March. Carradine left the party at 11. Chuck and Bob Wall left at 10:30 and drove the Bronco back to Los Angeles together over the next 2 days. They never discussed Day 9 on that drive, and they never discussed it again for the rest of Bob's life. Lone Wolf McQuade opened on Friday, the 5th of August, 1983, in 742 theaters. It grossed $12.2 million on a $4 million budget. The Hollywood Reporter called the final fight a memorable karate versus kung fu duel, while Roger Ebert gave it 2 stars and criticized the flat dialogue. Variety called Chuck a credible action lead. Most reviewers didn't mention Carradine by name, and the grenade ending was widely mocked. Only Chuck, Carver, Bob Wall, Mara Whitehead, and Robert Cohen at William Morris ever knew the real reason behind that ending. No one else on the unit asked. Chuck gave exactly 1 interview touching on Carradine on The Late Show with Conan O'Brien in 1994. When O'Brien asked about working with the kung fu star, Chuck smiled and delivered the line that's been quoted in every Chuck Norris biography since. "David Carradine is every bit as good a martial artist as I am an actor." The audience laughed, taking it as a joke. It wasn't. It was the only thing Chuck Norris ever said publicly about Wednesday, the 16th of February, 1983. Asked about Lone Wolf McQuade by a French journalist in 2003, Carradine offered a single line. By the end of that picture, he said, "They were like 2 old men, old injuries returning, new ones arriving, both of them stumbling around set." When the journalist asked him to elaborate, he declined. Between 2002 and 2005, Steve Carver and his producing partner Yoram Ben-Ami sued MGM, CBS, and Chuck Norris, arguing that Walker, Texas Ranger, was a derivative work of Lone Wolf McQuade. The case reached the Supreme Court, which declined to hear it in 2005. Carver lost, blamed Chuck for it, and never spoke to him again. He didn't tell the Day 9 story publicly for another 15 years. David Carradine was found dead in a hotel room in Bangkok on Wednesday, the 3rd of June 2009, at the age of 72. The cause of death was ruled accidental asphyxiation. The tabloids covered the story for 2 weeks. Chuck declined to give an interview. His publicist released a single line: "Chuck Norris extends his condolences to the Carradine family." That was all he ever said publicly about David Carradine. 37 years after that day on the riverbed, in a long-form documentary about canon-adjacent action cinema made for a streaming service, Steve Carver, then 85, sitting in his living room in Pasadena, told the Day 9 story on camera for the first time, and told the producers it was the first time he'd ever told it publicly. "I had 2 leads," he said. "One of them was the real thing. The other one had been pretending to be the real thing on television for 3 years. And on day 9, I watched the real thing put the pretender on his back in 30 seconds, and the rest of the picture was me, trying to make a film around a man whose contract said he wasn't allowed to have just lost." Asked whether Chuck Norris had ever apologized over the Walker Texas Ranger lawsuit, Carver said no, but added that he would now, if he could. He would tell him that on day 9 of Lone Wolf McQuade, Chuck had been the most disciplined man he'd ever directed, and that he'd given Carradine the uppercut on purpose, and that Carver had known it at the time and never said so. Steve Carver died on the 8th of January, 2021, 11 months after that interview. The documentary was released after his death. The continuity log from day 9, with the page where Mara Whitehead wrote, in shaking handwriting, "All right, Chuck, all right," sits in a banker's box in a self-storage facility in Sherman Oaks, California, labeled in black marker, LWM Production 1983. Do not discard. The box hasn't been opened since 1991. Mara Whitehead married Bob Wall in April of 1983 and became a high school English teacher in Encino. She retired in 2014 and has never publicly mentioned the riverbed. The location is still there, about 4 miles south of Texas, off a service road on Highway 20, still a dry riverbed, with no marker and no sign. The patch of gravel where David Carradine went down on his back in February of 1983 has been undisturbed for 43 years. The Bronco Chuck drove to set is part of a private collection in Houston. The world remembers Lone Wolf McQuade as the picture that made Chuck Norris a leading man, and David Carradine as the kung fu star making his comeback. It remembers the grenade ending as a strange choice nobody quite understood. It doesn't remember day 9 at all, and even if it did, it would remember the wrong 30 seconds. Anyone can throw a sweep. Bob Wall could throw it, a green belt could throw it, badly, and still put a man on his back if the geometry was there. The sweep took less than a second, and Chuck had drilled it 10,000 times before he ever needed it for real. It cost him nothing. The 8 days cost him something. It would have been easy on day 3, when Carradine started pushing past the choreography. One word to Carver, one call to the studio, and the problem disappears, the schedule holds, nobody gets hurt. It would have been easier still on day 6, with Carradine running his mouth by the wardrobe truck for 5 crew members to hear. Most men, pushed like that in front of an audience, answer it the same day. That's not weakness. That's just how people are built. Chuck wasn't built that way, or he'd trained himself out of it, which amounts to the same thing by day 9. He watched a man test him for a week and let every test go unanswered. He told Bob Wall to do nothing 3 separate times, when doing something would have ended it sooner and easier. He let a 46-year-old man with 3 whiskeys in his system throw 5 combinations at full speed in front of the entire unit before he closed the door on a single one of them. And when the moment finally came to close it, he didn't even close it all the way. He took a punch he didn't have to take, so that Carradine would have one thing to carry back to the William Morris Agency and call a draw. That wasn't instinct. Instinct would have ended the fight on day 3. What happened on day 9 was the result of a man choosing every single day for over a week not to use what he had. That's the part of the story that doesn't make it into the highlight reel, not the sweep. The 8 days before it, when the hardest fight Chuck Norris won was the one against his own hand. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. If you enjoyed this, then you'll love the stories from the behind the scenes of Chuck Norris's movies. Scan the QR code on the screen to get your copy, or visit realstoriesfromtheset.com. From the Coliseum fight with Bruce Lee, the 4 days in the West Texas dirt with David Carradine, the squib that nearly took his eye in Manila, the helicopters that went down in the Philippines, all gathered into one place for the first time. And remember to hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.